The city of St. Augustine was a crown of splendor built with glass towers that touches the clouds and streets that glitters under the sun. It was a city where faith and fortune worked hand in hand, where the poor prayed in whispers and desperation, and the rich knelt in golden cathedral draped in velvet and incense. At the very heart of this opulent world stood the St. Augustine Metropolitan Cathedral, a structure so magnificent it seemed to challenge between heaven itself, and seated at the throne of this holy empire was Pope Francis of St. Augustine, a man revered as much for his wisdom as he was for his humility. To the world, he was a saint. To those who knew better, he was a man standing in the middle of a growing storm. Behind the stained glass windows and the chanting choirs, a darker symphony played, one composed of envy, ambition, betrayal, and blood. No one imagined that within the hallowed halls of God's house, there brewed a hatred so deep that it would one day spill over, staining the altar itself. No one imagined that the man who caught the voice of God in the city would be found lifeless before dawn, his breath stolen by hands that once blessed him. This is the story of jealous priests, forged receipts, hidden money, burning anger, and a murder that shook the foundation of heaven and earth. This is the story of how they asked, wept, screamed, and demanded, who killed Pope Francis? Pope Francis of St. Augustine was not born in splendor. He came from the dusty streets of Orun town, a forgotten village at the edge of the old provinces. Yet, by the sheer force of his spirit, he rose, first as an altar boy who shined the bishop's shoes, then as a seminarian who studied theology under flickering candlelight, and finally as the youngest priest ever to be ordained in the city history. By the time he wore the white robes of leadership, he was a legend. Politicians kissed his ring. Businessmen fought to sponsor his charity events. Women named their sons after him, and the poor whispered his name into their rosaries at night. Yet, no all heart rejoiced at his success. In the ground halls of St. Augustine Cathedral, there were other priests in surplice and purple sashes and monsignors in heavy robes who looked at Pope Francis with admiration laced with something darker, envy, resentment, quiet, burning anger. Among them was Father Dominic, the financial secretary of the cathedral, a man whose heart once burned for God but now simmered in silent competition. There was also Bishop Michael Odua, a tall, stern man who had hoped to wear the white robe himself one day, and Father Emmanuel Nze, younger, eager to climb the holy ladder, even if it meant stepping on a few sacred heads. They smiled when Pope Francis spoke. They laughed at his jokes. They served mass with him, their hands steady and voice strong. But deep inside, they counted the days until he stumbled. And when the rumors began, whispers of missing money, secret donations, and falsified receipts, the wolves smelled blood. The grand city bells of St. Augustine Cathedral still rang every morning at 6. The nuns still sang hymns. The candles still flickered between the Virgin statue. But beneath the marble floors, the foundations were cracking, and in the shadow of the cathedral, a plot was already forming, a plot that would end with a body on the altar and the city asking the question, who killed Pope Francis? It started quietly. First, a missing envelope from the offertory box, then a donation check meant to the orphanage that somehow never reached the children's home. At first, no one dared speak. Who would accuse a fellow priest without proof? But the gossip grew legs. Father Dominic noticed the first irregularities. As financial secretary, it was his job to balance the cathedral's account, to make sure every dollar donated was recorded, every cent spent was justified. But now, the books were bleeding. Money flowed out in directions no one could explain. Dominic, sweating in his private quarters one night, ran his hand through the endless receipts, white papers stamped with red seals, some authentic, some clearly forged. How could this be happening under Pope Francis' nose? Or worse, was the Pope himself involved? Meanwhile, Bishop Michael Odua was gathering his own evidence. He had his sources, low-ranking priests, secretaries, choir members who saw too much. Whispers spews the confessional books, mask behind fake sense. And at the center of it all was the receipt room, a sacred archive where every transactions were kept, filed, and locked. One stormy night, Dominic met Bishop Michael in the old vestry. Rain hammered the cathedral's stained glass windows as thunder rolled across the holy city. "You have seen the missing funds?" Bishop Michael whispered, leaning close. Dominic nodded grimly. "Over $200,000 gone, and the receipt altered or destroyed." Michael's lips tightened into a crow's smile. "Then it's not a question of it. It is a question of when." Dominic's heart pounded. He understood. This was no longer about God's work. This was politics. This was war. And the first casualty would be the man in the white robe. The only thing left was to decide who would pull the trigger. The plotter grew in number. Father Emmanuel Nze, young and fiery, was brought into the secret circle. He had long harbored dreams of becoming the youngest bishop in the city's history, and the fall of Pope Francis could clear his path. At this, he hesitated. "But he is holy," Emmanuel whispered in one meeting, beads of sweat glistering in his forehead. "Holiness is no protection," Bishop Michael said sharply. "Even Jesus was betrayed by a kiss, and so the plan was burned." They would expose Pope Francis. They would present the forged receipts before the diocesan council. They would force a resignation. Simple, bloodless. Or so they thought. What they did not know was that evil, once invited, never leaves quietly. It demands a feast, and this time it demanded blood. The eve of the tragedy was not an ordinary night. It was the feast of St. Augustine, the cathedral's grandest celebration of the year. City governors, senators, and foreign dignitaries were all gathered under the massive golden dome, their laughter echoing against the ancient stone pillars. Cameras flashed. Choirs sang in voices that seemed to lift the heavens themselves. Pope Francis, dressed in shimmering white and gold, moved among the guests like a gentle tide, blessing, smiling, and praying. To the crowd, he looked invisible. But in the shadows of the marble corridors, three figures huddled, cloaked in robes ancestral. Father Dominic, Bishop Michael Odua, Father Emmanuel Nze. They watched him. The plan was supposed to be simple. Confront him with the evidence after the Mass, force him to resign, expose him to the diocesan council the next morning. But something shifted that night, something darker. The Mass ended at 11:45 p.m. The great bell tolled 12 times, signaling midnight. The guests began to depart, the heavy oak doors creaking open and shut. Pope Francis retired to his private chamber behind the altar, exhausted but joyfully. He knelt before a small crucifix in the corner, whispering his final prayers of gratitude. It was then he heard the footsteps. At first, he thought it was his personal assistant. He smiled tiredly and whispered, "Come, my son." But the figure that enters was not his assistant. It was Father Dominic, his face pale. Eyes glittered with something Pope Francis had never seen before: desperation. Behind him entered Bishop Michael and Father Emmanuel. The door closed with a heavy final click. "What is this?" Pope Francis asked. Rising slowly, Bishop Michael stepped forward, holding a thick brown envelope. Inside were copies of altered receipts, missing account statements, and forged donation records. "You have betrayed the church," Michael said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. But Francis looked at him, hurt flickering across his face. You believed I did this? You stole from the poor. Father Dominic cried. You built your empire on lies. Pope Francis shook his head slowly. You are wrong. You are deeply wrong. But anger has no ear. The confrontation spiraled. Voices rose, hands clenched. And then, in the heat of the argument, Father Dominic shoved the Pope. The old man staggered backward, tripping on the hem of his robe, falling hard against the marble corner of the altar. There was a sickening crack. His head struck the stone. Blood began to pool under his silver hair. The three men froze, staring in horror. Father Emmanuel fell to his knees beside him, shouting, Your Holiness, Your Holiness! But the Pope's chest no longer moved. His eyes stared upward, glassy and lifeless. He was gone. For a full minute, the cathedral was silent, only the candles dared to flicker. We have to hide this, Bishop Michael said hoarsely. He fell. Dominic whispered, his mind racing. He fell on his own. Will they believe us? Emmanuel's voice cracked. They must, but deep in their heart, they knew no one would believe that Pope Francis of St. Augustine simply fell and died. Not without asking hard questions, not without searching for receipts, not without finding the truth. And so they fled the scene, leaving the man who had once carried the city's soul, lying broken before the altar he once ruled. The body of Pope Francis was discovered at dawn by Sister Mary Clare, a quiet nun who came to light the morning candles. The moment she saw the pool of blood and crumpled figure near the altar, her scream pierced the stillness like a dagger. The cathedral doors were slammed shut. The police arrived. The city burst with a disturbed behavior. Detective Inspector Chinedu Okafor, known for his sharp instinct and cold determination, was assigned to lead the case. He arrived at St. Augustine's at 7:45 a.m., dressed not in his usual leather jacket, but in somber black suit, a sign of gravity of the matter. His eyes scanned the scene methodically. No sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no robbery, just a dead pope, and a faint trail of wax and footsteps leading back towards the priest's quarters. He spoke to Sister Mary Clare first, who, trembling, recounted how she found the body. She said she saw no one else. Chinedu nodded grimly. Someone inside the cathedral was lying, of that he was certain. A small team of forensic officers swept the scene. The marble floor was examined, fingerprints dusted, blood samples collected. Chinedu ordered the staffs and all the resident clergy members to remain within the premises. Interrogation began immediately. Father Dominic was the first to be called in. He entered the questioning room, a side vestry now converted for police use, wiping his sweaty palms on his cassock. You were the financial secretary, Chinedu began calmly. You handled the church's account. Dominic nodded, his face pale. Were there any recent disputes between you and His Holiness? Dominic hesitated. Only administrative matters, nothing serious. Chinedu's dark eyes burrowed into him. Are you sure about that? Dominic swallowed hard. Yes, but his hand trembled. Next was Bishop Michael. He sat rigidly, answering with clipped sentences, offering nothing extra. I had great respect for Pope Francis, he said. Yet, you were passed over for the promotion 3 times. Chinedu pointed out casually. Michael's jaw tightened. That is the church's will, not mine. But in his silence, Chinedu smelled bitterness. The type that fermented over years until it became deadly. Father Emmanuel was the last. He wept openly, his youthful face blotchy and broken. He was a good man. Emmanuel cried. We lost a scent. But when asked about the events of the previous night, his answers were inconsistent. He claimed he left early after Mass. Yet the security cameras, though few and poorly placed, hinted otherwise. At 12:15 a.m., a shadow matched his frame had been seen near the altar. Chinedu leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Three priests, three different stories, one dead pope. Someone was lying. Maybe all of them. And somewhere in the vault of the cathedral, the missing receipt, the heart of the conspiracy, still locked like snakes in the dark. Detective Chinedu knew the key to cracking the case was blood within the church's own archives, specifically the receipt room. Detective Chinedu knew the key to cracking the case was buried within the church's own archives, specifically the receipt room, a narrow fireproof vault behind the finance office, locked with three heavy bolts and biometric scanner that only four persons could access. Pope Francis, Father Dominic, Bishop Michael, and the diocesan accountant. The door had been broken, which meant whoever tampered with the receipt had official access. Chinedu summoned Father Dominic again. You said nothing was taken from the archives? Dominic nodded nervously. Then why? Chinedu said, sliding a photos across the table. Is the scanner long showing someone accessed the receipt room at 12:03 a.m., just minutes before Pope Francis was found dead? Dominic's face turned the color of chalk. I don't know. Chinedu's voice was quiet but razor sharp. Was it you? Dominic opened his mouth, closed it. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. It wasn't me, he whispered, but Chinedu saw the tremor in his hands. He knew fear when he saw it. Meanwhile, Bishop Michael began moving behind the scenes. Afraid that Dominic would break under pressure, he arranged a secret meeting with Father Emmanuel at a hidden side chapel late that night. The two men, cloaked in dark robes, whispered hurriedly under the dim light of the votive candles. You must stay strong, Michael hissed. If Dominic talks, we are finished. But what if he already has? Emmanuel's voice cracked. Then we do what we must be done. There was a heavy pause. You mean? Michael's eyes were cold. You know what I mean. But Dominic, already trembling under the weight of guilt, made his own plan. He decided he would confess, not to the police, but to the church, hoping for mercy. He scribbled a confession letter late at night, tucked it into his cassock's pocket, and headed towards the Archbishop's residence. He never made it. At 3:27 a.m., Dominic was found dead behind the cathedral garden. An apartment heart attack, said the first report. But Chinedu wasn't fooled. Dominic had bruises on his wrist, signs of a struggle, and the confession letter gone, wiped from existence. The noose was tightening around the conspirator, and Detective Chinedu vowed he would pull the whole rotten tree down, branch by branch, if he had to. The one who cancelled his sins will not prosper, but whoever confesses and renounces them will find mercy. On the third night after Pope Francis' death, a young priest named Father Peter Ume sat quietly inside the confessional booth of St. Augustine Cathedral. He was not part of the inner circle. He was not involved in the politics or the plotting, but he knew something. Something dangerous. As he waited, the heavy silence of the cathedral pressed against his chest like a weight. The candle flickered. Outside, the city neon lights blinked in the mist. Finally, the curtain shifted. Someone entered the booth opposite him, cloaked in shadow. A hoarse whisper came through a small grin between them. Father, forgive me, for I have sinned. Father Peter took a slow breath. What is your sin, my child? I was there. The voice cracked. I saw them. Peter's heart slammed against his rib. Saw who? He whispered back. The voice trembled. They killed him. Pope Francis. I saw everything. I heard the fight. I saw the blood. They thought he would just resign, but when he refused, they pushed him. Father Peter gripped the side of his seat. Who? Tell me who. But the voice broke into desperate sobs. I can't. Then silent. The curtain shifted again. The penitent was gone, vanishing into shadows like a ghost. Father Peter sat frozen. A confession had been made. An eyewitness had come forward, but no names, no faces. Just the heavy knowledge that somewhere among the priests walking these halls lurked a murderer cloaked in holy robes. The next morning, Father Peter went straight to Detective Chinedu. Breaking the sacred vow of confession was forbidden, but so was allowing a murderer to walk free. He told Chinedu everything he heard, and with that, Chinedu's investigation took a deadly new turn. He ordered a lockdown of the cathedral's ground. No one in, no one out. The hunter was circling his prey, and soon the truth would bleed into the light. The sins of some are obvious, reaching the places of judgment ahead of them. The sins of others trail behind them. The receipt room was still locked tight, but Chinedu knew the real evidence would be found in ledgers anymore. Not after the confession, not after Dominic's suspicious death. What he needed was something physical, something the killers couldn't deny. So he ordered a full brutal search of every inch of the cathedral, a priest's room, secret chapel, supply closets, even the sacred underground wine cellars. At first, nothing, but then, inside Father Emmanuel's quarters, hidden behind a loose brick near the fireplace, a young Forsyth's officers found it, a bundle of white cloth, hastily wrapped, stained with dark dried patches that had turned a sickening brown, a bloody robe. Not just any robe, it was the inner vestment worn by priests during Mass. It matches the ceremonial outfit Pope Francis had worn on the night he died. And worse, attached to the blooded cloth was a golden chain. Pope Francis' personal chain, a gift from the Vatican itself, blessed by the Holy Father in Rome, still tangled in the folds of the blood-stained fabric. Detective Chinedu stared at the evidence under harsh light of the Forsyth lab. The blood fibers were tested. They matched Pope Francis' blood type perfectly. He didn't need a prophet to tell him now. Someone had not just witnessed the fall. They had been close enough to touch the dying Pope, close enough to tear his chain, close enough to kill him. And the bloody rope hidden inside Father Emmanuel's room told a story far louder than any confession. The arrest was brutal. At 2:14 a.m., Chinedu and his officers stormed Emmanuel's chamber. Father Emmanuel was dragged from his bed, handcuffed as he wept and shouted, I didn't mean it. I swear, it was an accident. I didn't mean to. But no one was listening. The cathedral walls that had once protected him now watched him in silent judgment. As he was dragged to the corridor, priests and nuns peered from behind cracked doors, their faces pale with horror. The church had fallen, the mighty had bled. The city, once faithful and proud, would soon know the terrible truth. Justice and judgment are the habitation of the throne. Mercy and truth shall go before thy face. The trial of Father Emmanuel Nze was sat at the Grand Civic Court of St. Augustine. It began the most sensational event the city had witnessed in decades. The media camped outside for days. Helicopters hovered above the towering cathedral. Headlines scrammed across every newspaper. Who killed Pope Francis? Holy betrayer in St. Augustine? Faith in flames. Inside the courtroom, emotion ran wide. The prosecution, led by the ruthless attorney, Nora Onwubiko, wasted no time in painting Emmanuel as a man driven by ambition and jealousy, a willing pawn in a larger, darker conspiracy. She held up the blood robe before the jury, letting the heavy silence soak into their bones. This, she said, her voice like a blade, is the robe Pope Francis wore the night he died. This is the robe soaked with his blood, and it was found, hidden inside Father Emmanuel's room. Gasp filled the courtroom. Emmanuel sat hunched in the defendant's chair, his face a ruin of sorrow and fear. When he was called to the stand, he broke. Sobbing uncontrollably, he confessed, "We only meant to confront him, only to make him resign, but he refused." He said he would fight our accusation, that he would bring our sins into the light. Father Dominic pushed him. I swear it was an accident. And the blood? Nora passed. Nora pressed. I tried to help him. Emmanuel wept. I tried to lift him, but he was already gone. I panicked. I hid the robe. I didn't know what to do. Tears streamed down his face, but no amount of weeping could wash away the blood in his hands. The court, however, was not satisfied with just Emmanuel. Attorney Nora wanted more. She wanted the full picture. She wanted to burn the entire conspiracy to ashes. Who else was involved? She demanded. Emmanuel hesitated. Then he spoke two names, Bishop Michael Odua, Father Dominic, before he died. A murderer. A murmur spread like wildfire across the courtroom. The mighty Bishop Michael, who still preached sermons about justice and holiness, was now publicly branded a traitor and a killer. Warrants were issued. Bishop Emmanuel, upon hearing the news, fled. He ran to the countryside, hiding among forgotten villages, evading capture. But justice, like the hound of heaven, pursued relentlessly. 2 weeks later, he was dragged in chains back to St. Augustine, his once proud head bowed in shame. The trial ended with brutal finality. Father Emmanuel was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment for his role in the death of Pope Francis. Bishop Michael, deemed the mastermind, was given life imprisonment without parole. The city murmured, the church wept, and atop the once mighty St. Augustine Cathedral, the bells tolled, not in celebration, but in mourning. For innocence lost, for faith betrayed, for blood spilled on holy ground. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that he will reap. The city of St. Augustine's slow tried to heal, but the wounds were deep. The betrayer had cut through the bones and spirit. Mass attendance dropped. Donations withered. The cathedral, once vibrant with worship, now echoed with uncomfortable silence. Yet, Detective Chinedu knew something still didn't add up. Emmanuel and Michael had been caught. Justice had been served. But one question gnawed at him. Where were the missing receipts, the forged document, the falsified donation, the stolen money trail, the true financial scandal that had started this bloody domino effect? Those papers had vanished, like mist before the morning sun. Someone else was still hiding something. Weeks later, by sheer luck, a young altar boy stumbled upon an old leather satchel tucked behind a loose stone in the cathedral basement. Inside it, bundles of receipts, bank drafts, evidence of money laundering, sketching back 5 years. But the shock wasn't just the content, it was the signature at the bottom of the document. Not Pope Francis, not Dominic, not Michael, Father Benedict Opala. The quiet, humble priest no one ever suspected, the man who had spent years organizing charity events, leading prayer crusades, and serving quietly in the background. It had been Father Benedict who had engineered the financial theft. It had been Father Benedict who first falsified donations, and it had been his panic, his fear of exposure, that set the entire chain of death in motion. He had planted forged documents against Pope Francis. He had fed Bishop Michael and Father Dominic with evidence to ignite their anger. He had whispered in Father Emmanuel's ear about holy justice, and when the Pope refused to bend, he let the others pull the trigger. Father Benedict was arrested at dawn, trying to board a flight to Nairobi under a false name. In interrogation, he confessed everything, his voice trembling with a mixture of regret and madness. I never meant for him to die, he sobbed. I only wanted him gone so that I could rise, so that I could finally be seen. The ambition that poisoned his soul had finally devoured him, and the blood of Pope Francis cried out against him from the grave. 6 months after the tragedy, the cathedral reopened with a new ceremony of atonement. The new archbishop, a quiet, humble man named Father Augustine Anozie, led the service under a grey sky heavy with sorrow. The congregation wore black. At the center of the altar, a single white rose lay where Pope Francis had died. No grand choir sang, no politician spoke. Only a simple prayer was whispered. Forgive us, O Lord, for we have betrayed the blood you entrusted to us. Forgive us, O Lord, for we have turned your house into a battlefield of proud. The bells of St. Augustine tolled once again, not in triumph, not in victory, not but in mourning for Pope Francis, for the Church, for the broken souls left behind.